There was a piece in the foreword this week sent to me by Dee Dee Latcher. Thank you, Dee Dee. By Hannah Pollock, who has served as the foreword's archivist for the last 20 years. Pollock herself is a lesbian, and in the piece, she attests to the overwhelming silence about LGBT life in the pages of the forewords or the forewords past. Despite the conjecture that the editor of the Illustrated Sunday edition, Yiddish poet Morris Winnie Winograd, was gay, the pages of the paper had almost no trace of LGBT Jews or Yiddishists of the mid-20th century. When Winograd died in 1973, Isaac Bashevis Singer eulogized him and then dedicated a volume of poetry to his memory. No mention was ever made of Winograd's identity or his closet. It is so easy to forget how far we've come in how short a time. 1973 was less than 50 years ago. And it was the rare exception in those years for LGBT people to be out or accepted. We forget that to come out was to risk becoming a pariah, to be shamed not only as an eternal outsider, but as ugly, perverted, sinful, disgusting, damaged, dangerous. Homosexuality was understood as mental illness. It was regularly conflated with pedophilia and bestiality. In 1992, I started the peer hotline for LGBT youth in San Francisco. We received thousands of calls every month from kids all around the country, terrified that if their parents found out who they were, they'd be kicked out of the house or beaten, or if it got out at school, they might be killed. I'll never forget the story of one of the youth leaders in the National LGBT Youth Leadership Program that I started, who was beaten unconscious with a Bible by his classmates in his Indiana public school while his teacher looked on. Matthew Shepard was lynched in 1998. That's just 23 years ago. Today, we have the President of the United States tweeting to transgender kids, "I've got your back." How far we've come. I think about the dramatic change just in my own rabbinate in the last 15 years. In 2006, I was a rabbinical student assigned to a Reform congregation in Temecula, California, where I was boycotted for being a lesbian. The congregation split over it. About half the congregation were part of the boycott. The leaders of the boycott, members of the congregation, called me a sinner and said that those who were attending services were enabling my sin. In 2007, I interviewed for an internship at a Reform congregation in the LA area, in LA County, a Reform congregation, where the rabbi there said that if I worked there, people would have a problem with me being a lesbian, and he would not defend me, but that he would tell the congregation that he was, quote, keeping me away from the children. I did not work there. That was 2007, just 14 years ago. As recently as 2004, 60% of Americans opposed same-sex marriage. By 2019, just 15 years later, 74% of millennials supported it. More than 70% of all Americans today, say that trans people should be protected from discrimination and have access to gender-affirming surgery. A 2021 poll found that 1 in 6 Americans in Generation Z identify as LGBT. How, in 50 years, has our society so radically changed our minds and hearts on this question? Of course, the movement is not over. The work is not done. LGBT people, in particular trans women, in particular Black trans women, are still being killed. And there are regressive forces working to block progress and reverse it. But changed attitudes on LGBT rights are undeniable. And they are evidence that old, deep bias can be undone quickly. Remember, anti-gay bias goes back at least 2,500 years, we know, because we see it in our Torah. But in the last 50 years, we've seen it largely evaporate. We learn from this that entire societies can shift rapidly away from discrimination toward inclusion, toward embrace of diversity, toward empathy, toward love. It's widely understood that the success of the LGBT movement was caused by the strategy of coming out. When people had the courage to tell their stories, it became apparent that LGBT people were your children, your neighbor, your teacher, your aunts and uncles, your siblings, your friends, your coworkers. It became almost impossible for people to hold on to their bias when surrounded in daily life by the objects of that bias. What the LGBT movement did was redefine who is us in the us-them divide. Hold on one second. What the LGBT movement did was redefine who is us in the us-them divide. LGBT people who clearly in the 50s and 60s, 70s and 80s, even 90s and aughts had been a them for most Americans, gradually became an us. This was facilitated by the fact that LGBT people truly are in every part of the population, just as likely to be hedge fund managers as home healthcare workers, just as likely to be wealthy or white or male as poor or of color or female or trans. That inside access to the levers of power certainly was a factor in the speed of change. But this success is still instructive for other change movements, even if they lack that advantage. What Ibram Kendi taught us in Stamped from the Beginning is that bias narratives are created to defend structures and policies, not the other way around. In other words, we don't start with bias and then create oppression. We start with oppression and create bias to support it. Kendi documented exhaustively that racist ideas were developed to defend racist policies, like slavery. Homophobic ideas and rigid gender norms were created to defend patriarchy, men's subjugation of women. As gender roles become more fluid and women become increasingly liberated, homophobic and transphobic ideas don't serve a function and therefore don't make sense. In places that are more strongly marked by patriarchy, there's more homophobia and transphobia. In places that are less strongly marked by patriarchy, there's less homophobia and transphobia. Ask any Park Slope kid in elementary school today, and they simply don't understand what homophobia or transphobia are about, why anyone would have those ideas. In other words, our bias is based on our power relations. We see and tell stories in a way that justifies how things are. Who is beautiful? Who is blessed? Who is ugly? Who is cursed? Who is us and who is them? In our Parsha this week, Balak, the king of Moab, needs to dominate and destroy the Israelites who have camped near his borders. We have an us and we have a them. We see Balak attempt to create a bias narrative of otherness, of dangerousness, of ugliness, of cursedness. Listen for the language Balak is using and see if it reminds you of the way Pharaoh in Egypt described the Hebrews back in the first chapter of Exodus. I'm quoting from the Parsha. Balak, son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. Moab was alarmed because the people was so numerous. Moab dreaded the Israelites, and Moab said to the elders of Midian, "Now this horde will lick clean all that is about us as an ox licks up the grass of the field." Balak, son of Zippor, who was king of Moab at that time, sent messengers to Balaam, son of Beor and Pethor, which is by the Euphrates, in the land of his kinsfolk, to invite him, saying, "There is a people that came out of Egypt. It hides the earth from view, and it is settled next to me. Come then, put a curse upon this people for me, since they are too numerous for me. Perhaps I can thus defeat them and drive them out of the land. For I know that he whom you bless is blessed indeed, and he whom you curse is cursed." Balak's plan is to dominate and defeat the Israelites. The way he's going to do it is by getting a prophet to curse them. In order to curse them, the prophet has to see them in their ugliness, in their unworthiness, in their cursedness. This is Balaam's task, and Balak trots him out to several vantage points to help him develop that vision, which will become the narrative. In fact, the language of vision and seeing appears 33 times in this parasha. How we see others is often defined by the policy agenda of whoever's in power. Here we see Balak, the mighty king of Moab, using his power to create a bias narrative to justify what he's about to do, attack and destroy the Israelites. But in this case, it doesn't work because Balaam is beholden to a bigger power than Balak. And that power, Adonai, is on the side of the Israelites. So no matter how hard Balaam tries to create Balak's bias narrative, he cannot. He tries to see them as ugly, but he can only see their beauty. He tries to see them as bad, but he can only see them as good. He tries to see them as cursed, but he only sees their blessing. Once we see that the thems of the world are really us's, once we see that our bias is just a story that someone else crafted to defend their agenda, an agenda that doesn't even serve us, we see that we're being used, like Balak used Balaam. Once we dismantle the power relations and the policies and the structures that uphold those power relations, the bias will no longer have a function and will evaporate. It can be fast if we will it. We just need the will. Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov, mishkenotecha Yisrael. How good are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. These were the words of blessing that came out of Balaam's mouth when he saw the Israelites camped below. May we change the policies and structures that keep us biased so that we too see beauty and blessing and good in others and in ourselves until all of the thems become us. Happy Pride. Shabbat Shalom.